Pizzi, and I'm so delighted to welcome a panel of truly illustrious scholars, authors, historians and journalists tonight, and I'll introduce them one by one in due course. And welcome everyone, both those of you who are in person in our beautiful building, Senate House building, and those of you who are following us online. And please be advised that we'll have a Q&A session at the end, but for technical reasons we can only have it for people who are in the room. But of course people who follow us online are welcome to stay for the Q&A. Welcome to the Institute of Languages, Cultures and Societies, School of Advanced Study, University of London. We're meeting today under the auspices of the John Coffin Trust Fund of the University of London, and my deepest thanks go to the Trust, as well as to the Levantine Heritage Foundation for generously enabling this gathering. This symposium promises to be truly remarkable. For the first time today, we set out to explore an Adriatic city, Trieste, through the lens of the Levant. And it is my genuine hope that our conversation tonight will stimulate further forays into this little explored as yet, but very fertile field, not least because of human movement, diaspora and displacement occurring in this area today. Meaning originally the rising sun, the Levant is a term introduced in the 13th, 14th century to describe the lands to the east of Venice. Since making its first appearance in the English language in the late 15th century, all Mediterranean lands east of Italy came to be designated by this umbrella term. And for those of you who don't know where Trieste is located, you have a map here that shows it very well. Trieste is a relatively small-sized harbour city located on the northeastern cusp of the Italian peninsula. Ruled by Austria since the 14th century, Trieste grew exponentially since the Holy Roman Emperor Charles VI declared it to be a free port. Indeed, not a free port, but the major free port of Austria-Hungary in 1719. The successor to Charles, the Empress Maria Theresa, boosted development and urbanization, as we're shortly to hear in the next intervention. In just over 1 century, especially following the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869, the city rapidly became the busiest, the wealthiest, most substantial commercial port of the vast empire. A hub of mercantile interests teeming with ethnicities, cultures, languages and religions, Trieste could legitimately stake a claim to be the major Adriatic gateway to the Levant since the waning of the Venetian Republic in early modern times. Now this grand gateway didn't pass unnoticed. George Eliot photographs it in an intensely lyrical passage of Daniel Deronda, his so-called Jewish novel of 1876. I'm going to read a short excerpt that you have on the screen now. I feel myself back in that day when my life was broken. The bright morning sun was on the quay. It was at Trieste. The garments of men from all nations shone like jewels. The boats were pushing off. The Greek vessel that would land us at Beirut was to start in an hour. I was going with a merchant as his clerk and companion. I said, I shall behold the lands and people of the East. It was the first time I had been south. The soul within me felt its former sun, and standing on the quay, where the ground I stood on seemed to send forth light, and the shadows had an azure glory as of spirits become visible, I felt myself in the flood of a glorious life. Now, wow, what a glowing gateway to the Levant. George Eliot compellingly captures Trieste here, as it would have looked like at the peak of traffic's thronging with people and goods, spanning over the vast Austro-Hungarian Empire and beyond. Mordecai, the character whose words we're hearing here, tearfully brings back to mind his first encounter with this resplendent, this dazzling, quasi-mystical Mediterranean harbour. Trieste stands as the glittering intersection of multiple trade routes, stretching to the four cardinal points and across the eastern Mediterranean, to Hungary and Russia to the north, to the Balkans, Greece and Turkey to the east, and also to the Aegean and the Black Sea and the Indies further to the south. Trieste was indeed one of the world's major ports at this point in time, second only to Marseille and far more substantial than Barcelona and Genoa. Merchants and their families made their home in Trieste, pursuing business and everyday activities through the conduit of a Triestino dialect, a rich heteroglossia of Italian, German and Slavic, spliced with a Venetian syntax. James Joyce will shortly be drawn almost magnetically to this, as Maria Todorova puts it, this exotic blurring of Orientalism and Balkanism. Now, Trieste must have struck Joyce as a Levantine doppelganger of his native Dublin when he first arrived there in October 1904. Joyce proceeded to move there and spent the following 15 years of his life in Trieste, and very happy times they were for Joyce. His companion Nora gave birth to his children. He began penning the Ulysses. He made lots of friends and contacts while in Trieste. Joyce left Trieste only once in this arc of time, returning to Dublin in 1909, as you can see, to manage, with the task of managing Ireland's first cinema, the Volta Picture Theatre on Mary Street in North Dublin, funded by Triestean capital. As you can see from the picture, this is the building as it looked when, or shortly after Joyce left. To the right is the way the building looks now, which is hardly recognizable, but you can still sort of make out the building, the outline of the building, and the plaque that you see as now memorializing this Joyce's presence as a manager of this picture house. Now, at the time, Trieste had no fewer than 21 cinemas. Dublin had none, so this was the first one. And it is perhaps not widely known that since the late 19th century, much capital was invested in the burgeoning film industry in Trieste, contributing substantially to its development, both locally and internationally. Despite Joyce's utter failure as a cinema manager, and he hastily returned to Trieste less than a year later, Trieste's special relationship with the moving image never came to pass. Indeed, the city rapidly honed a cinematic identity of its own, based on a more or less spurious Ottoman and Levantine heritage, increasingly seeping into Western production, especially during the Cold War. Now, the geopolitical map of Europe had, of course, both rapidly and radically altered during and after the First World War, the collapse of the empire, the demise of fascismo, the end of the Second World War, and the onset of the Cold War. And please forgive me my giant stride across several crucial, important historical decades. Following contributions will shed much needed light on this time. But in the map of post-Second World War Europe, Trieste is situated at the southern brink of Western Europe. In his renowned 1946 speech, best known as it begins, "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic," Winston Churchill chooses to highlight Trieste. However, careful here, no longer as a gateway, but rather as a gatekeeper, a bastion of Western values set against a curtain made of iron in name only. In fact, this is a fractious and brittle frontier, hard-pressed to contain Eastern communism. Trieste's glorious past is reframed in terms of an exasperated polarity between East and West. The city's cosmopolitan appeal endures, of course, but is duly refigured. And it is perhaps not surprising that Algiers and Casablanca, the North African cities powerfully portrayed respectively in Pepe Le Mocor of 1937, starring Jean Gabin, and in the titular 1942 film with Ingrid Bergman and Humphrey Bogart, they offer a fairly implausible, indeed a generic term of comparison with Trieste. While Trieste entrepreneurs continued to invest in the film industry, Hollywood and Cinecittà followed suit, repackaging Trieste for booming post-war audiences as a den of iniquity typified by mystery, intrigue, and seedy exoticism. And here in the slide you have a smattering of titles, but there are many, many more. Dozens of feature films swept into Western cinemas between the 1940s and at least up until the late 1980s, so the fall of the Third War, if you will. All of these films featured Trieste as an imagined Levantine city, dropping the city's name at times randomly for exoticizing purposes. And here you have a handful of titles, but literally there are many, many more. And so, in conclusion, I'd like to just briefly have a short look at this particular film, feature film, Diplomatic Courier. It's a Hollywood, black and white Hollywood production starring Tyrone Power. And Power impersonates an undercover agent here, seeking to recover top-secret documents detailing Joseph Stalin's covert plan to take over Western Europe. And if you read the caption on the top of the poster, the agent is the #1 target for 1,000 enemy agents from Paris to Salzburg to Trieste. Trieste, the city, features prominently in this film. It really takes the lion's share in terms of screen time and is portrayed unequivocally as a geopolitical wasteland, a loose fringe of the West, heaving with spies, with refugees, exiles, smugglers and dodgy agents, flowing in and out of a menacing East. This Trieste is both a gateway and a gatekeeper. And bear in mind this sort of tension, this ambiguity, because it really accompanies Trieste throughout its long and glorious history. This ambiguity and tension between it's a gateway, but it's also a gatekeeper, an obstacle. So drawing on its rich and diverse historical and cultural heritage, reframed in globalized ecosystems, Trieste continues to leverage, to some extent at least, its distinctive status today, retaining a dazzling hold on the collective imagination. Thank you very much. And I hope this introduction has touched upon many themes and topics that will come up in following contributions. And so I suggest that we hold off any comments or questions to the end, to the Q&A at the end, and we move on swiftly to our first speaker, who is Richard Bassett. And Richard is going to talk about Maria Theresa, 1717, 1718, and Trieste. Richard Bassett is a visiting professor of history at the Central Europe University of Budapest and a By Fellow of Christ's College, Cambridge. He's the author of numerous works on Central Europe, including Forgotten Kaiser of 2015 and Last Days in Old Europe of 2019. And Richard Bassett's biography of Maria Theresa will be published by Yale next spring. So Richard, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Katia. Well, Katia, thank you very much. It's a great honour and pleasure to be invited to participate in this event, which, as Katia says, is truly groundbreaking. Rarely has a city of the size of Trieste been exposed to such analysis in the Anglo-Saxon world. And I'm going to talk to you for about 20 minutes, really, about the connection between Maria Theresa and the city, because the city really owes many of its later developments to her policies, and in particular, her policy of saying, welcome to Trieste, come to Trieste, we ask no questions. Meaning, if you come and do business in Trieste, you won't be given a hard time by the Austrian authorities. On the contrary, they will provide a framework for which you will be enabled to conduct your business as profitably as possible and as predictably as possible. Qualities which, of course, with the end of the Austrian Empire in 1918, many Triestine writers have commented on the transition to a less predictable Italian state bureaucracy, but I don't want to be too polemical about this. Now, I can give you the first, just to show you where we are and lighten this rather dull, overcast London day. Here we have a view from the Napoleonica promenade, which is on the Carso above Trieste, looking east towards the Istrian Peninsula. And I chose this because it's important to stress. Many people, probably in Italy, might find that the comments that Trieste is the gateway to the Levant, or a Levantine city, somewhat sort of controversial. But it is, without any question, part of the Levant system. And the greatest testament to that was the British corps d'élite, the Levant consular service, one of the most fascinating branches of the British diplomatic and consular service, the Levant consular service. Its westernmost posting was Trieste. Trieste was under the jurisdiction of the Levant consular service, which meant that any dispatches from the consulate didn't go to London. They went first to Constantinople, then were sent on to London. So Trieste's role in the Levant is very important. Now, Maria Theresa comes to the throne in 1740, and she has one great gift. Surrounded by enemies, she has an uncanny ability to select extremely good advisors. And one of the ones that helps her enormously in Trieste, she appoints governor in the 1770s, Karl Zinzendorf. And this portrait, which hangs, as you may recognize, in the castle of Miramar, misidentified as Joseph II, though anyone familiar with Joseph II would know this is not anything like Joseph II. It's a very rare portrait of Zinzendorf, and I'm hoping one day someone will inform the Italian authorities that it is Karl Zinzendorf. But Zinzendorf said in his very voluminous diaries, which have been now translated and published, that essentially Trieste was nothing if it was not an emporium for trade. And it was he, in fact, who quoted Maria Theresa as saying, welcome people to Trieste, we ask no questions. So Zinzendorf is one of those figures who is keen to develop the possibilities of trading in Trieste. In doing this, he is in fact, however, simply continuing the policy that Maria Theresa's father initiated, as Katia said, when in 1719 he declared Trieste a free port. 2 years earlier, he declared the freedom of the seas, the navigation, and then the declaration of the free port in 1719 begins to get certain things moving. And in particular, it begins to attract a wave of emigration from other parts of the Levant. And Maria Theresa, when she comes to the throne, is of course considered to be delicate, vulnerable. Virtually every state in Europe proceeds to tear up their previously earnest obligations of support to her, and there is an attempt to essentially partition, if not dismantle, the entire Habsburg Empire. Historians tend to focus on Frederick of Prussia seizing Silesia, but in fact the Bavarians were marching into Bohemia, the Saxons wanted to take Arabia, and Spain was after the Italian side of the possessions. So Maria Theresa, portrayed as she was as this rather delicate, feminine woman, was clearly in a very tricksome position. But within 5 years, she had rather reinvented herself. Here's a portrait of her, a very rare portrait of her as Judith with the head of Frederick of Prussia. And one of the things that she managed to do was, through her advisors like Zinzendorf, was to harness what you need more than anything else to fight a war against countless enemies. And that's not just an army, but the sinews of war, money. That's where Trieste began to become very important. She raised, or gave an order. It's important to stress Maria Theresa herself never set foot in Trieste, but she was intimately connected with the developments. So she gave the instruction to raise the walls of the city, which I don't have a beamer or anything, but if you see on the right, that's the Trieste Castle Hill, which still exists, of course. And here you have this new grid, which is called today the Borgo Torresiano, with the so-called Canale Grande in the middle of it, and the huge barracks of the House Regiment of Trieste there on the left. So she is the, if you like, inspirator of this very, very advanced exercise in urban town planning. But who's going to live in these buildings? Here we come to some very interesting developments. And here's another view of the Borgo Torresiano from the air. In 1746, so this is only a few years after she had come to the throne, she passes the first of many patents, as they're called, which gave quite interesting freedoms and privileges to the Jewish community of Trieste, culminating in 1771 in the so-called privilege. And here is a highly treasured specimen of this privilege, the original privilege granted by Maria Theresa to the Jewish community in 1771, giving them exceptional freedoms. Exceptional because they were actually unavailable not only in other parts of her empire, but in fact throughout the rest of Europe. And this document, which the Jewish community of Trieste rightly treasures, has a very interesting preamble. We, Maria Theresa, is the opening paragraph, you can just see it at the top there. The internal happiness of our natural subjects, always having been the principal object of our concerns and actions of our regency, are being persuaded that external commerce contributes effectively to such happiness. We have not spared effort or funds in order to progress, both making commerce prosper, especially in Trieste, and improving the conditions of merchants, subjects, and foreigners. The Jewish nation, especially suited to commerce, invited by the general patrons of our most august parent. Now this is an extraordinary word, invited, not tolerated. 10 years later, Joseph, her son, usually conceived to be a darling of the Enlightenment, proclaims, if you like, the great patent of toleration. But here, the Jewish community it's stressed that they were invited by the general patrons of our most august parent, arouses our most merciful particular reflections, all the more since the settlements of the nation in Trieste already constitute a formal community. We therefore wish to give the Jewish community in Trieste a solemn demonstration of our sovereign approval. And this is really, Maria Theresa is usually characterized as an anti-Semitic bigot, but you can see from this document that the record is rather more mixed. And so the Jews are the first, if you like, community to be recognized and supported legally, but they're followed, of course, by the Greeks. Here is the lovely Orthodox church on the seafront, Trieste, San Nicola dei Greci, as it's called. And in 1751, so 6 years after that first patent has already acknowledged the existence of the Jewish community as a corporate body, the Greeks get the same in the Orthodox community. But the Orthodox community is rather complicated at this stage because, as well as Greeks, it includes Serbs. And so, in order to distinguish between the two and the Armenians or Unions, Maria Theresa then has to pass up further patents, which, in fact, when I show you this, give a great deal of autonomy to the Serbian community. This is a much later building than the Theresian era, the Palazzo Cottakis along the Canale Grande. And I don't know if you can see that there are two statues on the facade. One is the Serbian king, Lazar, who dies on the field of blackbirds in Kosovo, and the other is his wife, Milica, who becomes a nun in perpetual mourning. And these are Serbian heroes, known to anyone, particularly any Serb, familiar with the history of their nation. And those statues are an indication of how the Serbian community, following in the footsteps of the Jewish community and the Greek community, in 1773, still Maria Theresa is granted exceptional privileges too. A few years later come the Protestants. Lutheran and Calvinists are allowed to have their own buildings in Trieste. And so by the time Maria Theresa dies in 1780, not only has the population become increasingly, if you like, cosmopolitan, it has also virtually trebled in size. And we take, for example, the Jewish community, where at the beginning of her reign there were only 18 families registered in the Jewish community. By the end of her reign, there are nearly 350. So, and that is going on with the other groups who are coming. It is a city of emigration, or immigration, if you like. So, this is the patent granted to the Serbs. You notice 1773, she's quickly put in her titles to the partition of Poland, which was a few months earlier. And so she is mentioning here Lodomeria and why have we got this thing?
It's the people following us from
That's fine. Well, that's fine. Take my word for it. Anyway, this here, Lodomeria, which becomes Austrian partition of Poland, is included in this particular patent.
I know inside. Excuse me, I think that if you hit the top left button, it should collapse. If you hit the top left of the line there, hopefully, yeah.
Thank you. Sorry. So that's the Serbian patent. And I put this in to show that the classical architecture, which is such a feature of the Borgo Teresiano in Trieste, is really coming from Vienna, because here is the side elevation of the Gloriette by Maria Theresa's favourite architect, Ferdinand von Hamburg, in the top of the hill of the Schönbrunn Palace. And you see, with the columns, the entablature, there is a strict new neoclassical style already in Vienna in the mid-1770s. And this becomes eventually, a generation later, or within a generation, very much the style of the new architecture, the Borgo Teresiano, and then the Borgo Vicentino, named after her son, in Trieste. And the most obvious example being, of course, the church of 1800 by Pietro Nobile, an Austrian architect from Ticino, who has done a lot of work in Vienna and is bringing this new neoclassical style very much to Trieste. And I'm going to just linger, if I may, on the neoclassicism, because what is so fascinating about Trieste is the old Borsa Exchange, also a monumental classical building, occupying a position that in most Italian towns would be occupied by a cathedral or a large parish church. But here, the cathedral is not a religious building, it's a building devoted to commerce. And Trieste is helped in this by the fact that the clerical presence, with the suppression of the Jesuits in 1773, is very much reduced at an intellectual level, and it is not, compared with the surrounding Veneto, in any way a clerically orientated city. If you go 10 miles west of Trieste, you will get into the Veneto, where in any town or village, the parish priest has literally the power of, at least morally, salvation, or lack of salvation. That, if you like, influence, overwhelming influence of the clerical authority did not pertain in Trieste. And the building, classical building which reflects that perhaps in the best way is the famous Rotonda, I say famous Triestine Pancera, which has a number of very interesting facets about it, because the other element that's missing in Trieste, apart from clerical authority, is a strong, overwhelming local aristocracy that doesn't exist in Trieste. And in fact, I can quote the French Albert Comte de Moray, who in 1808 comes to Trieste and says, "The past is dead. At the pinnacle of the new society, there will shine no longer the noblemen of our ancient lineage, but bankers and merchants. At Trieste, the true pioneers are all those who have gathered from the most diverse lands to remake their lives and who become comrades here in the steady work they carry out in the shadow of Mercury and Minerva and Neptune, three figures that you see virtually on every 18th century and early 19th century building in Trieste. The city is the most suitable and certain for success. It is the Philadelphia of Europe, consoler of the afflicted and refuge of sinners. For emigrants, that is Trieste." So, I think in Triestine dialect, Guazabulia, which is a chaotic medley, is called a Zabazak. So the Triestine dialect very early on was very happy to acknowledge this mixture of different melting pots of people. What I find interesting about this building, and unfortunately I haven't got it in detail, but if you look at the reliefs, they are scenes from the life of Coriolanus. And of course, one of the scenes is showing Coriolanus rejecting the demands of the aristocracy of Rome for him to return. Again, it's an image, if you like, tailor-made for Trieste's identity in the early 19th century. So, what about financing and exploiting Trieste as a hub? So, with Maria Theresa's accession, the enemy for Austria is Prussia and the other European states. It is no longer the traditional enemy of the Habsburgs, the Ottomans. And here, Maria Theresa wanted to send a message to those in Constantinople that she was very well disposed towards the Ottoman world by having herself painted by Lyotard, who had spent some time in Constantinople and had brought her some Turkish clothes. There she is portrayed in the Turkish costume, a la Turca. But a costume would not be enough. We had to have some other things as well. And I draw attention to the fact that this wonderful molo, which anyone who has been to Trieste, of course, will enjoy the sunset every day from, actually has as its foundations the remnants of a ship called the San Carlo, which is why the molo is called the San Carlo until the end of the First World War. And that ship was actually part of Maria Theresa's father's attempts to have a trading company which sailed from Trieste and indeed from Ostend to not just the Levant, but the world beyond, to Asia. And Maria Theresa in the 1770s had a chance to resurrect this idea when a man called William Bolts said, well, as the British are distracted by their war with America, why don't we make some inroads again into the East India Trading Company? And of course, the Austrian global vision, which was coined first of all by Frederick III in the 15th century, AEIOU, Austria era in orbe ultima, or Austria est in parare orbem universum, that Austria has a global mission. This was very much something which Maria Theresa felt she could develop in her trading links coming from Trieste eastwards. This portrait of Bolts is the only known image we have of him, and we know it's him because it's on the house where he resided in Trieste, and most of the houses in Trieste will have some indication of the status and personality of the owner. So, for example, a copy, someone who was trading in coffee in Brazil, his reliefs on the facade might have images of the conquistadors and the subjugation of Latin America. So there are lots of clues in Trieste. You have to sort of take your time and gradually get to know them. So Bolts' enterprise didn't last very long. The British closed it down fairly quickly, despite the War of the War of Independence in America. But in one way, Maria Theresa demonstrated that you don't need either an army or a navy to conquer the world. And that was with this extraordinary thing, the Maria Theresian dollar. I say dollar because, of course, it's a thaler, but if in Austrian dialect you make your T's into D's, it becomes a thaler. And thaler, the dollar, is obviously very simply achieved. There are 65 million of these coins in circulation even today. It's a staggering amount of coinage. And in the 19th century, the Bedouin tribesmen refused to accept British gold sovereigns. It's the reason why General Gordon died in Khartoum. The relief force came 48 hours too late because they couldn't get enough camels, because they didn't have enough of this coin. They only had gold sovereigns. There's a wonderful telegram from Garnet Wolsey to the Foreign Office saying, our gold sovereigns command no respect amongst the Bedouin tribesmen. All they wish for are Maria Theresian taras. Now, what's so interesting about this is that no less an economist than Keynes felt that the thaler was a unique example, unique in Europe at that time, of a country allowing its currency to be used beyond its frontiers. In other words, according to Keynes, Maria Theresa understood very clearly the lessons of Adam Smith, supply and demand, and no other country in Europe would have permitted its coinage to be used beyond its frontier in the 18th century, only Austria. So it's rather appropriate that the Baron Fries, who was Maria Theresa's principal banker and was in charge of her mint, was able to not only use the coin beyond the Austrian frontiers, but actually mint the coin in parts of Europe which were not Habsburg possessions, notably Augsburg. So he set up a mint there, and appropriately enough, his palace in Vienna is the one closest to the Hofburg. So it's even more appropriate that in Trieste they have now commemorated Maria Theresa. They would have been too late for the last big anniversary, but last year, better late than never, they erected as a monument to her this giant Maria Theresian tower, and appropriately enough in the hallway of Theresian. So that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm calling Philip Mansel. Well, Philip Mansel is our second speaker, and Philip will talk about Trieste, Alexandria, and the Archduke Maximilian. Dr. Philip Mansel's books include Constantinople, City of the World's Desire, 1995, Levant, 2010, Aleppo, The Rise and Fall of Syria's Great Merchant City, 2016, all of which have been translated into Italian. Philip Mansel is a founding committee member of the Levantine Heritage Foundation and the Society for Court Studies. He's also a fellow of the Institute of Historical Research, our sister institute across the neighborhood, and the Royal Historical Society. Philip's latest book is King of the World, The Life of Louis XIV, which was published by Penguin in 2019. Over to you, Philip.
Thank you very much, Katia. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for all the people who helped this symposium. Edward Cheney, who put me in touch with Katia, Craig, whose idea it originally was, and by the way, he can help you join the Levantine Heritage Foundation if by chance any of you are not yet members. And I want to speak today, carrying on from Richard, about the Habsburg interest in Trieste and its Levantine qualities. Maybe like Smyrna, Alexandria, Salonika, and other cities, it put trade first, as Richard has stressed, and consuls played a very large part in the life of the city, including the great Richard Burton, British consul in Trieste, as they did in Levantine cities. They were transmitters of deals before ideals, and above all, what I found preparing this lecture, the very strong and varied Ottoman links which defined other Levantine cities were also present in Trieste. And another characteristic is polyglottism. Many posters were in 5 languages: Italian, German, Slovene, Croat, and Friulish. William Dean's Hull, Italian Journeys, 1867, he says, "All costumes are seen here, and all tongues are heard in the Bourse." Many people were trilingual or quadrilingual, including French, and Fausta Cialenti, who I'll be coming to later, an Alexandrian from Trieste. She says everyone spoke several languages in addition to Triestino, And here is a picture of the port of Trieste in 1802, and please note, bottom left-hand corner, some people are in Turkish or Greek costume, and it is by the great artist of the Levant, Kassas, who went everywhere from Istanbul to Palmyra to Alexandria to Cairo and to Athens. So another link. And before I forget, another great polyglot of Trieste is the great author Claudio Magris, and in his wonderful book on Trieste, he talks of Dr. von Economo, Constantine von Economo, who spoke Greek with his father, German with his mother, French with his sister, and Italian with his brother. As we all do. And in addition to the Serbs and Greeks, Richard has talked about, Ottomans were present in Trieste from the 18th century. Here is the boss on the right and the statue of Leopold I, the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I, on top of the column, also stressing this is a city where dynasty married business. The Habsburgs always protected Trieste because it was good for their empire. And here is one of the first Syrians to come to Trieste. He is called Anton Faraoun, who arrives in 1784, probably originally from Damascus via Egypt, and the first, but by no means the last, to wear such costume in Trieste. So it's really becoming an international Levantine city by 1800. Some travellers say that the women are dressed à la manière des Levantines, and le habit dessus tient beaucoup de ceux des Orientaux. And then 1821, Giuseppe Brodmann talks about the liberal and open tone of the society of Trieste, and in particular it is the businessmen who compose in Trieste the first and most distinguished of classes. As Richard was saying, it's a big business city, and just to show this extraordinary Habsburg interest, 1818, the rather forgotten but extremely interesting Emperor Franz I visits Trieste. He goes to the boss and he inscribed in his own hand his name on the register of the guests at the casino. So he's taking it under his protection. And here is another, which is Schiavone, who is an artist of Trieste. In Rupen Karabin, he's an Armenian from Aleppo who is bringing horses to the emperor. So Trieste is dealing in all sorts of goods, coffee, textiles, and horses also. And it's a city not only of businessmen, but also of exiles. A lot of French exiles in the French Revolutionary Wars, including, he says, his aunt, Madame Adelaide, who dies in Trieste in 1800 in the house of Signore Borlo. And this is the tomb of the Spanish Carlist pretender who, under Austrian protection, lives in Trieste and in fact has a court in exile and his own throne room in exile, and is buried in the cathedral. He called himself Charles V, King of Spain. And one of the characteristics of a Levantine city is deals before ideals. Here is another great figure of Austrian Trieste, Karl von Bruck. He comes as an idealistic young man in 1821. He's going to help the Greek Revolution, but in fact he stays in Trieste and puts trade and empire first, and he's later a minister of finance of Franz Josef after 1848, and he has a dream of a great Middle European customs union from Hamburg to Trieste, and of course it would be based on the Austrian Empire and would add to Austrian power. And he actually said, "Long live the cosmopolitans," and he founded one of the great institutions of Trieste, the Austrian Lloyd Shipping Company in 1837. And Austria is now deeply committed, more than most people realize, I think, to the preservation of the Ottoman Empire as a barrier against Russia. Metternich writes, it is as important to us as the preservation of the Austrian Empire itself. They're so already neurotic about Russian advance. And Lloyd Triestino is one of the weapons, because rather amazingly, backed by the Austrian government, subsidized, it is a privileged partner of the Ottoman Empire, transporting Ottoman troops, more or less where the government was, to the Crimea, to the Yemen, 1885 in the Adriatic, and the maximum annual number of passengers ever transported by this great Trieste company was 1878, 136,000 forced migrants, Circassians, who were going from the Balkans to Anatolia and Syria. This great repeopling of the Ottoman Empire by Muslim refugees from the Russian and Slav advance is done by a Trieste company with the support of Austria. So they're really basically preparing for the First World War. And Franz I repeatedly says, I'm a friend of the port. I will do anything to help it. And in fact, Austrian boats transported Turkish troops during the Greek War of Independence. And they grabbed a lot of the trade which Greeks had before. And this Austrian protection continued. 1844, there is a great fete when Franz I's son Ferdinand arrives in the port with the courts of Austria, Tuscany, and Modena, and singing fishermen arrive on boats offering fish to the emperor on his steam yacht. And gondolas, the whole city is illuminated, and Princess Metternich says it's a unique entertainment. I've never seen anything so beautiful. And more Austrian connection with trade, with this time with Egypt. This is a group from Palazzo Revoltella, I think it's called. And it's a symbolic group showing the wealth. I think it's the River Nile under the protection of Austria, trade and so on. I mean, the symbolism. It's a wonderful museum and palace in the city. This is the Morpurgo Palace, also trading with Egypt and the Ottoman Empire as Trieste becomes ever richer in the 19th century. The Greek Museum. This is some, thanks to Richard Cavagresi for the photograph, this is some of the Greek patrons who were commemorated in the Greek church of Trieste. You see the dates of their deaths up to 1970 and the number of the names, Raleigh, Economos, and so on. The Serbian church. And another great figure of Trieste, also showing Habsburg protection, is the Archduke Maximilian, the younger, more liberal, and rather more charming brother of the Emperor Franz Josef. And here he is going on a tour around the Ottoman Empire. 1850, he's being entertained to lunch by the governor of Smyrna, of Izmir. And he describes it all in a wonderful travel book, which should be republished, which I recommend to everybody, called On the Wing, which was translated at the time into English. And it's really a love letter to the Levant, the Mediterranean. Every stranger in I'm quoting, every stranger in Trieste seeks to live on the quay. The quay is one of the crucial places of every Levant city. And he talks about Chinese, Indians, Greeks, and so on. And he adores Smyrna. He calls it the proud princess of the East. He describes his lunch with the governor. He said that the melons were so sweet they melted like sugar on the tongue. They all drank champagne because champagne had been discovered after Muhammad's death, so it couldn't have been forbidden, and so on. A very long description of this meal. A rather horrified description. This is a picture of the slave market of Smyrna. And he calls it my beloved Smyrna. And although he thinks the Ottoman Empire is weak and rotten at the core, although of course it survived the Austrian Empire. And he loves the rough sea, tossing upon the mighty waves. He notices that Izmir houses are already being furnished with furniture made in Trieste, another link with the Ottoman Empire. He describes Greece and so on. And he actually brings back, let's hope they were servants and not enslaved people, from his travels in the Ottoman Empire. There are 2 young African servants in this Turkish room that he creates in the Villa Lazarevic, which was his first house in Trieste. He's appointed commander of the Austrian Navy to give him something to do away from Franz Josef. And here is another Turkish room. I don't think they still exist. I think they were dismantled or moved to Miramar. And probably there were other Turkish rooms in Trieste houses as there were in other cities of Europe. And here is the wonderful castle he built on the edge of the Adriatic, 1856 to 1864. It's his love letter to the sea. It's also a power statement adoring monarchy in general, and of course the House of Habsburg in particular. Here it is again, well worth a visit, a monument to 19th century dreams. And here is the central throne room, very vainglorious pictures. On the left, a family tree of the House of Habsburg. On the right, a map of the global empire of Charles V. And I fear this encouraged him to accept the fatal offer of the throne of Mexico, which was made in Miramar, just outside Trieste, in April 1864. And I think the real motive was really to have his own power, his own empire, away from his overpowering brother, Franz Josef. Anyway, it's here that he received the offer. All the Triestinos who, when he was very popular, warned him, don't go, don't believe it. It's supported by Napoleon III, you can't rely on him. But yet he accepted, very probably encouraged by his wife. And here you see his wife in, I think she's the one in pink, greeting the Empress Elizabeth, and Franz Josef and Maximilian are in the boat. Maximilian is in naval uniform, Franz Josef in military uniform, and you see the British flag, so they're using a British boat, which is rather humiliating for Austrian Habsburgs in Trieste. This is 1861 by Cesare del Acqua, who is another Triestino 19th century painter. Here he is, the fatal offer, the global reach of Trieste going to Mexico from Mexicans, most of whom hadn't been there for a long time, and they lied to him, but he wanted to hear their lies, saying there had been a plebiscite in his favor. Here he is leaving with his wife. You see everybody's cheering him, the new Mexican imperial flag on the boat, and inevitably, that's 1864, 4 years later he comes back in a coffin to Trieste. It was a disaster, and many people died to fulfill his ambitions. But I think that shows Trieste is looking outward. And another sign, and here is the monument to him that was built, that was formerly in Miramar, is now in the square in Trieste. He's in naval uniform, a symbol of the lost naval heritage of Austria. And here he is with a symbol of Egypt, which he also visited in the 1850s. And as it's becoming more prosperous, more ships arriving in the port, the English are arriving. There is a Trieste Britannica, as there's a Rome or Turin Britannica. Robert Whitehead, who invented torpedoes for the Austrian Navy, lived and married in Trieste. Richard Burton, of course, the consul, 1872 to 90. And Ernesto Nathan Rogers, an Italian architect, was from Trieste and was uncle of Richard Rogers, the famous modern British architect. And of course there's James Joyce, and then a friend of Richard Bassett's, Goffredo de Banfield, who was the last living knight of the Order of Martyrs. And he wrote of Trieste, "My real fatherland is this city and this port where I was born," something that many other inhabitants of cities have felt more than surrounding country. And here is another sign of Ottoman influence. There's a fountain in Trieste, a Bosnian cafe in Trieste, about 1870s. And I now want to come to another example of Levantine links. The Slovene ladies who, via Trieste, went to Egypt as nannies or maids, servants or companions to rich Egyptian families, Europeans living in Egypt and Egyptians themselves. In fact, the lady who brought up Boutros Boutros-Ghali, who was Secretary General of the United Nations, was from Slovenia. And a film has been made about them, and I hope to get an English copy one day. Here is a group in Alexandria between the wars. And here is a lady called Joseph Finney, born in Slovenia, met in Trieste, Oswald Finney. He was the richest businessman in Alexandria between the wars, and they gave the most famous carnival parties, which are memorialized in the Alexandria Quartet by Lawrence Durrell. So, and she died in emigration in Rome after Nasser took power in Alexandria. But several thousand, no one knows the exact numbers, but several thousand Slovenian girls went to Egypt in this strange trade. And in the film, there are Alexandrians remembering, oh yes, we loved them, they were so warm and friendly, not like the English nannies who were so strict. And here is another link between Trieste and Egypt, a very wonderful writer called Fausto Cialenti, whose mother was Wieselberger from a family of Trieste, and she's written a novel that you see on the right, which has been translated in French, not in English, called The Four Wieselberger Girls, about Trieste before 1914, where she talks about the racial conflicts, the Slovenes against the Italians, the terrible tragedy of the end of Austria. In Trieste, you sometimes felt you were in Vienna, but there were lots and lots of street songs against Franz Josef, even before 1914, and people made rude noises and rude remarks about him. They were bathed in irredentism, this extraordinary word for Italians who wanted to join Italy. They thought that by doing so they would be redeemed, as if a nation could redeem people. And she calls Trieste the most luminous, the most attractive, and the most civilized place in the world. And she, amazingly, her daughter had married an Englishman after living in Egypt, where she made anti-fascist broadcasts for British services. She then finally went to live with her daughter and died in Pangbourne, this lady from Trieste and Alexandria. And then before 1914, more and more international. The Austrian Lloyd is spreading its wings to Constantinople, to Japan, to India. 1912 there is a regular service to Shanghai. A source of prosperity to the city. Here you see it again, going to Alexandria from Trieste. Here you see the map of the Austrian Empire, and it's you see where Trieste is on the fault line between Slavs and Italians. And the last manifestation is the Congress of Trieste, organized to find a new ruler for Albania. So Trieste has produced a ruler for Mexico. Also for Albania, it was organized by Baron Franz Noxa, who is here photographed in Albanian costume. I call him Lawrence of Albania. He was the Austrian agent, spy, traveler, geographer in Albania. Here he is with his partner, and in fact he committed suicide after the war. It was a homosexual violin. And they produced a king, Prince Willem of Wied, who leaves Trieste in March 1914, and it's the last example of the concert of Europe in action, because he's chosen by all the powers of Europe in agreement. There is a federal European force in Albania, which doesn't do much good, and his secretary is the man on the left, who is a Triestino from the Heaton Armstrong family, descendants of Robert Armstrong. And I'd like to conclude, maybe Alex Kedros could say a few words about the Greeks of Trieste, what happened to them in the First World War, because it shows that city spirit could be stronger than national and state spirit. Because 1916, Greece goes to war with Austria, but
so what Mr. Pisani, an old friend of mine, used to tell me is that when Greece entered the war, the Austrian authorities told the Greek community that we have to put the Greeks that are of military age, we have to intern them. And Baron Raleigh, who was a very important member of the Greek community, went to the Austrian government representative and told him that I guarantee that no Greek is going to take any action against Austria. And the Austrian representative said, your word is enough, I don't need to do anything more.
Thank you very much, Alex, whose father was Greek consul in Trieste. I think it shows that despite wars and the horrors states inflict on cities, communities can survive where there's a will. And I'd like to conclude with some words of Camille Julien on Bordeaux, which also was a Levantine city in its way. Today, in face of absolute and monotonous states, and even colder and more despotic international ideas, the municipal spirit can become, in the same way as family life and love of the soil, the safeguard of human liberty and dignity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Philip, and indeed Richard as well, for incredibly rich, amazingly rich and wide-ranging contributions. There's so much on the plate here. So I welcome to the floor Michael Cottakis, who will take us forward chronologically, and his paper is entitled Europe Ablaze, Narodny Dom and the Great Fire of Smyrna. Dr. Michael Cottakis is a historian of the Eastern Mediterranean. He obtained his PhD in 2023 from the London School of Economics. He's also the CEO of 89 Global, a public sector advisory firm which provides strategic, policy and operational advice to governments around the world. Michael has written articles and columns for publications including the Washington Post, the EU Observer and Caffè, and has made various TV appearances. But best of all, I think, and we're going back to the polyglot tradition that Philip was talking about, Michael speaks 7 languages. He speaks French, Italian, Spanish, Greek, and Turkish. And he also has a reading knowledge of Ottoman Turkish. So, over to you, Michael.
Thank you very much. 7 languages, none of which I speak particularly well, I should say. Hopefully I can speak English well enough to deliver this lecture. So thank you very much, Katia, for giving me the floor. It's a great pleasure to be here this evening. And it's a great honour for me to follow such distinguished speakers this evening. Richard and Philip have given us a really profound illustration of an earlier period in Trieste's history, when the city really was at the apogee of its strength as a cosmopolitan and mercantile hub, when it was the maritime jewel in the Habsburg Empire's crown. Both Philip and Richard have explored just how, through Trieste, the great Central European monarchy was able to reach out and touch the Levant, Alexandria, Smyrna, Constantinople. This evening, I will focus your attention on a later and somewhat darker period in the city's history, on a moment of transition during which the city changed from being this cosmopolitan hub to being a city in the Kingdom of Italy, something of course became the abasement of its considerable Slovenian population and the ending of its days as a cosmopolitan port at large. Of course, it remained cosmopolitan in some senses, but as a Habsburg cosmopolitan port, it was no longer. So in telling this story, I'd also like to piece together the wider international context surrounding it, and to think about various contemporary trends which it bore witness to, and also some of the later events which it faithfully foreshadowed. And to do this, I will compare the experience of Trieste with that of another great port city of the Mediterranean, the city of Smyrna, known today, of course, as Izmir in Turkey. So this is a postcard, a panorama of Smyrna, which I have taken from the archive of the Levantan Heritage Foundation. I'm very grateful for the Levantan Heritage Foundation for many of the pictures you're going to see this evening. Like Trieste, Smyrna would cross 1900 at the absolute peak of its powers, would be reduced by the 1920s to something of a rump of its former self. And Smyrna, like Trieste, would see its cosmopolitan nature extinguished in a rather swift and violent manner. In both instances, both for Trieste and for Smyrna, destruction by fire would be the critical final act symbolizing this transition from a Europe of empires and cities to a more monochrome Europe defined by ethnic competition and by the autarkic nation-state. So this evening I'm going to discuss 2 seminal events in both cities' histories, separated by 2 years, 2 events that encapsulate this transitional moment. Both will be compared for their similarities, but also for some obvious differences. Now, I view the violent events that took place in Trieste and in Smyrna during the early 1920s, if not as causal reverberators for the later, more portentous and more devastating events of the 20th century, then certainly opening salvos in a political tumult that would soon devastate the old ethnic fabric of the European continent. And by placing Trieste and Smyrna at the centre of the story, I'd like to show how the world of the cosmopolitan port cities was deeply entwined with the ethnic nationalisms that would ultimately prove their downfall. Historians often view port cities as symbols of a seemingly bygone era empires and monarchies. My view is that these port cities should instead be seen as key dramatis personae of modern European and world history, critical to understanding the central political developments of the 20th century. So here's the Canale in Trieste. Let's set the scene. Trieste, as we've heard from both Philip and Richard, was the major cosmopolitan port connecting the Central European world and the Mediterranean world. It was a link between several important cultural spheres, the Italian, the German, and the Slavic Balkan. Also, there was a considerable Jewish element, as we've heard today. It was a great city of trade, enterprise. It faced south towards Egypt and North Africa, and it faced east towards Smyrna, Constantinople, and the Ottoman Empire. So between the late 18th and late 19th centuries, when the city was at its commercial height, it controlled almost all of the Habsburg monarchy's maritime trade. It had a sort of buccaneering, free trading outlook, an entrepreneurialism very different to your typical Habsburg city, but similar perhaps to more Italian cities such as Venice in earlier times and Genoa. And this, of course, was held by its status as an imperial free city, as we discussed earlier, which allowed it to stand somewhat aloof from this great Habsburg economic landmass, and perhaps also from the clutches of the Catholic Inquisition. So this is Frank Street in Smyrna, the great European Oxford Street equivalent of Smyrna, where much of the commercial activity took place. And Smyrna, like Trieste, was a cultural melting pot and a connecting point between east and west, but it wasn't always the case. When we think about trading links between east and west, our mind is naturally drawn to cities such as Constantinople and Aleppo, but due to several historical contingencies in the 19th century, perhaps a bit early, also in the 18th century, and also certain geopolitical changes, Smyrna had emerged as the principal export hub for the Ottoman Empire, controlled around 40% of Ottoman exports in the late 19th century. It's a huge amount for a city of Smyrna's size, considering also the other cities that were part of the Ottoman Empire, cities such as Constantinople, Salonika, and of course we had further flung cities, Beirut, Baghdad. Smyrna controlled 40% of Ottoman exports. It was also a city that held a near monopoly over the exports of certain goods, particularly carpets. It had a 90% monopoly over the export of carpets from the Ottoman Empire. So Smyrna's proximity to the newly opened Suez Canal was certainly important in understanding why it was so commercially central in the 19th century. It's allowed it to kind of fall into the slipstream of the major global trading route of the time, the route between Western Europe right down through the Ottoman Empire to the subcontinent through the Suez Canal. Smyrna was sort of caught into the slipstream of this trading route. It sucked in foreign capital and allowed it to act as a sort of vast urban clearinghouse, a midway caravanserai, you could say, between the worlds of Western Europe and the subcontinent. Of course, Smyrna also benefited from the increasing weakness of the Ottoman state, which was withdrawing gradually and was less able to regulate and apply protections to trade. So here is the Dutch consul of Smyrna, Edmond de Hospierdt, seated with members of his family at his garden villa in the Buja district of Smyrna. De Hospierdt was one of several hereditary consuls that lived in Smyrna. These consuls were important. We've talked about consuls in Trieste as well. The consuls of Smyrna were very important because their countries had been granted capitulations. These were essential rules that allowed merchants from these countries to trade according to the rules of their home country. So French merchants could trade in Smyrna under French rules, Dutch merchants under Dutch rules. And consuls like de Hospierdt and their retinues were granted the power almost to police the city's trade in collaboration with the local vali, the governor of the city. And so you could say that by the late 19th century, whilst of course Smyrna was a Near Eastern and an Ottoman city in terms of its political administration, in terms of its economic infrastructure, it had great important elements of a European nature running through it. So it was a city with European elements. It was an amalgam, you could say, of East and West, but it was very much a Near Eastern city. And this can be seen in the population, which of course was highly mixed. Here are Armenians, powerful, small but powerful merchant community that lived in Smyrna from the 18th century onwards. Many had fled from the collapsing Safavid Empire in the late 17th century, early 18th century, and had come to live in Smyrna. They had great global networks that were connected across Eurasia, networks in India, they had networks in London, and they were very powerful, even if they were a small part of the Smyrna trade. They controlled almost 40% of the trade in carpets. They were extremely influential in the carpet trade. And there were also Sephardic Jews, not Jews who had come from Spain, as in the case of Salonika, but Jews who had come from Portugal. Many had come via Amsterdam after they had been evicted from Portugal by the crown. These Jews were less prosperous than other communities in the Mediterranean, such as Salonika, but they were an important part of the commerce of the city. And then, of course, there were Muslims, Turks. This was the second largest group in Smyrna by most counts. They participated less in the economic and business life of the city, less than the Armenians and the Jews, certainly, as we should also see less than the Greeks. But they were very important because they set the rhythm of life in the city from a political and military perspective, to the extent that they can. And here are members of the regional government of Izmir. You can see the vast majority of them are wearing fezzes or turban-style head accessories. And just below we can see the Vali, the regional governor, Rahmi Bey, who was the last governor of Smyrna. He was a benevolent and wise governor who sought to maintain good relations between the various groups of the city. So we mentioned the Greeks. In other port cities such as Alexandria, Constantinople, Salonika, Beirut, indeed Trieste, the Greeks were a very small, although a powerful minority. But in Smyrna they were the largest group and perhaps the majority according to some censuses that we have for the late Ottoman Empire. So there were rich and poorer Greeks. We can see on the left-hand side of this slide a fruit seller. Those of you who read Greek, Hamagiotis, that was the name of the fruit brand. And then on the right we see Aristotle Onassis, who was of course the great Greek shipman and shipping tycoon of the 20th century. At the height of his wealth, he was possibly the richest man in the world. He was born in Smyrna and had great links with Trieste as well, and ultimately with Argentina. So I focused a lot on Smyrna because we need to paint a picture before we discuss the relationship between Smyrna and Trieste. So I've tried to provide a sort of snapshot of the vibrant cosmopolitan world that existed in the city and show its similarities to Trieste. These cities and others were part of a great world system of trade, a series of aquatic highways that connected in the Mediterranean, and thus the interactions between them were considerable. Port cities were places of opportunity for ambitious merchants, places for ambitious people to come to seek their fortunes. And they were somewhat separate from their nations and from their empires. There were places where hybridity of population was encouraged because it was good for making money, it was good for commerce. But even as ports such as Trieste and Smyrna were becoming more cosmopolitan, the world around them was fast changing. This world of multi-ethnic empires was slowly being replaced by a more monochrome one of monolithic nation states, one language, one people, one history. It's a paradox perhaps, considering the sort of rosier story of diversity and interaction that we've tried to lay out today. But port cities were also principal intellectual hotbeds and drivers of nationalism in the Mediterranean. This image here is from a little bit later. It's the arrival of the Greek army at Smyrna in 1919, which we shall talk about. So many leaders of nationalist movements hailed from or had experienced port cities. On the left here you see Adamantios Korais, who was the intellectual father of Greek nationalism. He was born in Smyrna. No prizes for those who can guess the person in the middle. That's Mustafa Kemal Pasha, later Ataturk, of course the father of Turkish nationalism, the modern Turkish state. He was born in Salonika. That's General Nasser, or would become General Nasser. General Nasser was born and raised in Alexandria. So taking some Italian examples as well. Of course, these are very different figures, as you can imagine. We have Giuseppe Mazzini, born in Genoa. We have Gabriele D'Annunzio, born in Pescara. And on the far right, literally and metaphorically, we have Francesco Giunta, a fascist leader who lived the majority of his life in Trieste. So this is an image of a different city, which we've not spoken about today, the city of Salonika, which was perhaps the first of the great cosmopolitan ports to begin to fall to nationalism. This is the Greek army arriving in Salonika after the Balkan Wars in 1912. And as cosmopolitan places, it's fair to say that cities such as Trieste and Smyrna were sort of petri dishes for the crystallization of new identities, in which people gained a firm understanding of who they were as a function of who they were not. Indeed, it could be said that port cities provided the perfect conditions for ethnic competition that could ultimately lead to the sort of jealousy and animosity that presages conflict. Superiority and inferiority complexes abounded. The Greeks of Smyrna, as the dominant ethnic group, resented political rule by Muslim Ottomans who they deemed less civilized. Pious Smyrna Turks saw Greeks and Western Europeans as pollutants of conservative Islamic traditions, and increasingly as a stunt on the aspirations of poorer Muslims to break free from poverty and attain economic power in a city which they saw as theirs. Now, World War I saw these trends turbocharged into a spiral. With the war came fresh territorial claims by the new nation states, Italy, Greece, of course Turkey, emerging phoenix-like from the ashes of the Ottoman Empire and Yugoslavia. Trieste and Smyrna were suddenly caught in a venomous vortex of nationalism. But the twin effects of irredentist state policy on the one hand and the fervent tensions developing within the populace of both cities led to a situation which ultimately became uncontrollable. In 1918, Trieste became part of Italy, and straight away was a hotbed of nationalist tension. The ongoing struggle between Yugoslavia and Italy over the control of the Fiume-Rijeka region dragged Trieste into its crosshairs and threatened to consume the city. Over the next couple of years, fascist agitators, those who supported Gabriele D'Annunzio and later Benito Mussolini, arrived en masse with a simple agenda, to Italianize the city and thus extinguish possible Yugoslav claims. So this image here is of Fiume, and this is where Gabriele D'Annunzio was essentially established a kind of city-state for Italy, and he was looking to expand Italian influence further south as well. So in May 1919, Smyrna was occupied by Greek forces, and a cycle of violence and counter-violence erupted between Greeks and Turks. Angry Turkish bandits called Chetes took to the surrounding hills and harried Greek villages in retribution, torching churches, schools, and homes. These are the Chetes on a postcard. So in Trieste, the tension between Italians and Slovenes turned ever darker, with organised armed bands of black shirts roaming the streets and beating anyone who could utter words in Slovene. One Slovene academic noted at the time how the city reeked of fear and threat, and we knew not whether we would live or die. Here are black shirts concentrating by the port of Trieste. So going back to Smyrna, on the pretext that it needed to protect itself from hill bandits around the city, the Greek government made the fateful decision to advance deeper into Anatolia and attempt to create a hinterland around Smyrna. Now, in reality, the choice to advance was a function of the great idea, which was a Greek nationalist project aimed at acquiring territory in the east and resuscitating the Byzantine Empire, or a Greek state in the east. So the tension among Greek politicians and military leaders was a considerable one. There was a temptation to advance further because the opportunity presented itself, and advance they did, initially with certain successes, beating back irregular Turkish forces and advancing almost up until Ankara before finally being held there. So this is Narodni Dom in Via Fabio Pizzi in the centre of Trieste. In Slovenian, Narodni Dom literally means the people's house, and this building was the beating heart, one could say, of Slavic culture in Trieste. It was constructed in 1905 by the Slovene-Italian architect Max Fabiani as a house of culture, primarily for the city's Slovene community, but also for other Slavs, for Czechs, for Serbs and for Croats. It housed several major cultural institutions. It's one of the preeminent centres, you could say, of Slovenian culture anywhere in the world. Of course, Trieste at the time was the preeminent Slovenian city in terms of population. So Narodni Dom was a symbol of the Slavic fabric of the city, but it was also a symbol of the cosmopolitan nature of the city. Not only did Slavs find a place to stay and a place to interact at Narodni Dom, but also other ethnic groups of the city. Italians, Greeks, Jews would participate in events that took place at Narodni Dom. There was a hotel there on the second and third floor of the building, which held these big soirees, big balls, and was a very important centre for all types of inter-ethnic and intercultural interactions within the city. So in 1920, July 1920, tensions between Italy and Yugoslavia in the Adriatic would spill into open violence. On the 11th of July, 2 murders in Split, in Spalato, in modern-day Croatia, committed by Croat nationalists against Italian naval officers, led to a series of violent retaliations across history. Francesco Giunta, who we spoke about a little bit previously, was the leading fascist official in Trieste at the time. He raised a band of black shirts and carabinieri in Trieste, in the east of the city, and stormed a local weapons depot to concentrate weaponry before proceeding west to Via Pizzi. And there, beside Narodni Dom, Giunta gave a speech, a sort of rally, attended by masses of people, supporters of the fascist political movement in Italy at the time. The crowd cheered, shots were fired, and ultimately Narodni Dom was stormed by a mixture of carabinieri and members of the watching public who participated in the rally and heard Francesco Giunta's speech. The interior of Narodni Dom, as you can see here, was utterly destroyed. The facade remained. Firefighters attempted to come to the scene to put out the fire, but they were stopped by the carabinieri and told, you will not be doing that. And so the building burnt. That's it, in the aftermath of the attack on Narodni Dom. So by the summer of 1921, the Greek army in Anatolia had advanced up until Ankara, but its supply chains were very stretched, and its baggage train was infested by malaria, and of course it was not able to continue the fight. A rapid counterattack by the Turkish cavalry led by Mustafa Kemal Pasha beat back the Greek advance, and within about a year the Greek forces arrived back in Smyrna, but on the way they committed several important atrocities, burning mosques and villages, and generally adopting a scorched earth policy in the lands of Western Anatolia. So this is Mustafa Kemal Fevzi Pasha sitting beside him on the 9th of September 1922. It's the day of the arrival of Turkish forces in Smyrna, 2 days after the evacuation of the retreating Greek forces. So the Turkish armies occupied the city, and for a day or so the occupation was relatively orderly. But by the second day, the events took a zealous and more violent turn. Armed mobs in the streets took apart Greek shops, they burnt houses, and they attacked cultural institutions. The Greek Archbishop of Smyrna, Archbishop Chrysostom, was killed in an extraordinarily gory manner, which I won't describe here today, but it was a lynching of the Archbishop, who had been an active participant in the nationalist project of the Greek armies in Anatolia. Most faithfully, perhaps, of all, on the 13th of September, a fire started in the Armenian portion of the city and spread into the Greek and European districts. The fire was allowed to burn unhindered for several days, 4 days to be precise, with the Turkish authorities doing little to stop the blaze. The sky was reputed to have turned a ruby red and then finally black with smoke, and the screams of those trapped and dying could be heard for miles around. Now, according to most estimates, 60 to 80,000 people died in the burning of Smyrna, as it later became known as. Deaths were from burns, smoke inhalation, and of course from drowning as people attempted to escape the burning city via the quay. Perhaps a terrible symbol of the destruction of the cosmopolitan port city was the burning of the quay, which was also central to the life of all cosmopolitan Levantine ports. The death toll of 60 to 80,000 means that the burning of Smyrna ranks perhaps as the greatest single urban fire, the deadliest single urban fire in modern human history. So how do we view these events together? How do we relate the burning of Narodny Dom with the Great Fire of Smyrna? So Narodny Dom and the burning of Smyrna are comparable in some ways, but not in others. They're different for one in their scale. The death toll from Narodny Dom was only 3 people, including 2 hotel staff and the organizer of one of the central administrator of one of the cultural institutions of Narodny Dom. In Smyrna, of course, the death toll was several thousand times more than that. In Narodny Dom, we see a targeted and planned attack on a single institution, albeit an important cultural one. In the burning of Smyrna, the atrocity was less targeted, far more diffuse, far more haphazard. There were differences too in the preludes to each attack. Narodny Dom resulted less from military provocation and more from a sense of injustice at the Treaty of Versailles, for which Italy had been promised a great deal more than it was ultimately given at Versailles, led to considerable resentment. The burning of Smyrna, of course, came after the Greek invasion, which was an act of conquest and violence, and so there was a considerable military provocation in the background. But there were differences too in terms of the aftermath. So it's true that the fire of Narodny Dom presaged a long period of oppression for civilians in Trieste, but considerable numbers of Slovenians remain in the city and continue to live in the city today. Of course, the burning of Smyrna saw the total eradication of the Greek population of the city, and was legitimized ex post by the Treaty of Lausanne, providing a framework for the population exchange, which saw 1.5 million Greek Orthodox Christians of Anatolia deported to Greece in exchange for around 600,000 Muslims living in Greece who left for Turkey. So here is an image of the extent of the fire at Smyrna, taken from an American ship. So we talked about differences between the two events, but there were also significant commonalities, which is what we need to discuss today, what links the two cities and both events. So in both cases, these were acts of ethnic violence which had the aim to exterminate or to intimidate an undesirable group, either through acts of killing or through deportation or through intimidation. In both cases, the presiding officials purposefully allowed events to play out with no interest in saving human lives or preventing destruction. Indeed, thousands of radicalized locals watching the events unfold chose to participate in the vandalism and the violence. Their experience of living in cosmopolitan port cities seemingly not counting very much at the time. Now, the choice of instrument for this destruction was fire, and this carries a special significance in this story. So fire represents total, irreversible destruction. The implication of a place destroyed by fire, rather than one inflicted by plague or by conquest, is that old is forever lost and must be built again from scratch. Fire puts a seal on ethnic cleansing, but the physical destruction of property means the victims can never return. So Narodny Dom and the burning of Smyrna are similar to earlier ethnic pogroms in their style and in their substance. They particularly resemble various attacks on Jews that occurred throughout history, from the Jewish pogrom at York in the 1180s, to the Inquisition's attacks on Iberian Jews in the 15th and 16th centuries, to the Russian pogroms of Polish and Ukrainian Jews in the 1890s. In each case, there was intimidation, forced deportation, and destruction by fire. Indeed, we know that the fascist and nationalist movements of the early 20th century were inspired and activated by precedents of earlier violence against European Jews. But Trieste and Smyrna should be seen as part of a separate, more modern historical pattern, and the context surrounding them is absolutely key in this case. So both symbolize a political imaginary redolent of the early 20th century, in which nations could exist and excel only if ethnically pure, and thus that unwanted elements should be flushed out lest they pollute the wider whole. In this view, such purity could be physically engineered by the state through a repertoire of violence, destruction, population exchange, or genocide. Through the 1920s and into the early 1930s, it's fair to say that the potency of this playbook increased before meeting its fiercest articulation in the 1940s, when between 20 and 30 million European Jews, Poles, Ukrainians, Russians, Belarusians, Germans, Hungarians, Roma, Czechoslovakians, Greeks, and others killed. So this is a logic we continue to see in the fields and the cities of eastern Ukraine, where Russian authorities are committing atrocity after atrocity against an enemy which they have dehumanized. Europe faces new trials of strength, in which it will be required to draw on deep historical memories to ensure history does not continue to repeat itself. Now, to end on a more positive note, I want to return to Trieste and Smyrna today. So their heyday as cosmopolitan port cities has passed, but both remain bustling cities on the Mediterranean. Trieste is the largest port in Italy, Smyrna the second largest in Turkey. Both continue to be important centres of business despite almost wholesale changes in their political institutions and in their populations. And they are slowly coming to terms with their pasts. In 2014, Narodni was reopened as a cultural centre for Slovenes in Trieste and is now managed jointly by the Italian and the Slovenian states. The building is not only champions Slovenian culture in Istria, but it also hosts reconciliation events to keep alive the memory of 1920, to rebuild relations between Slovenes and Italians. So this is a symbol of a city embracing its cosmopolitan past, at a time when cosmopolitan societies around the world are under considerable pressure. This is Izmir today. It's wonderful Dubai-style development you can see on the waterfront. This is my Katia. So Greeks are starting to return to Izmir as tourists, but also as business people and investors. They are encouraged by a friendlier and more relatable local business environment than in other parts of Turkey, and of course by proximity. Islands like Chios and Lesbos are only a few kilometres away, and it's fair to say that the old links between these places and Izmir are beginning to be resuscitated. Indeed, in the last decade, new direct shipping lanes have been opened that ferry visitors back and forth. So this draws a final and perhaps loftier statement on the enduring nature of the port cities. And I'll end on this. So the fortunes of port cities may change across time, but they're more consistent in the history of humanity than perhaps any other social construction. Empires, nations, and leagues often combust with violent abandon, but even after the collapse of empires like the Habsburg or the Ottoman, cities like Trieste and Smyrna, today Izmir, continue to thrive. And it's this capacity of cities for survival and reinvention, something which Trieste and Izmir appear to be showing, which must rank as a singular wonder of the human experience. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michael. We really needed that sort of last piece of the jigsaw puzzle that showed us how the cosmopolitanism sort of etiolates into a darker sort of moment, darker side, but then yet again, cyclically, there's a sort of return of sort of glowing cosmopolitanism and possibility and resilience. So thank you very much. I mean, this incredibly rich set of contributions. Thank you so much to all our speakers. We have a few moments for questions. I can see the glasses gleaming in the distance, but we do have a few minutes for questions. And so please, I don't think we have a microphone, but I think if you, yes, we are audible, so please.
All right. Thank you so much, everybody, for that today. I just have a question about dialect. This is, by the way, my first language, technically, I guess, Triestine, I guess. I'm going to say Triestino, so it's Italian, but anyway, I just wanted to ask a question about, I think it was Mansel, you mentioned that earlier about you mentioned the posters in the Australian Times. I think in 5 languages, but not dialect. And I was interested in that.
No, I think they did all speak dialect. I may but Richard would know more about this,
I was talking about the posters.
It is just a form of Italian.
The last poster put up on the walls in the Habsburg Times in 1918, where the governor of Trieste said that after nearly 600 years, it was with deep regret that he felt Austria would have to now withdraw from relationship with Trieste. That was printed in Slovene, Italian, and German. Now, Triestine dialect is a kind of lingua franca, so everyone could speak it. Everyone who was trading in Trieste would use it, and they tended to learn the basics of it. And it has, I think it's fair to say, it's been one of the most resilient of Italian dialects. I mean, Milanese dialect is very difficult, it virtually disappeared. But Triestine dialect is absolutely alive and well. But I'm not aware of any official Habsburg documentation because Triestine dialect was a dialect. But people in imperial service, like my friend that Philip mentioned, Geoffrey Banfield, he would have had to, in his naval training as an officer, he would have had to have learned at least 4 languages: Croatian, Turkish, German, and Italian. But he would have spoken Triestine dialect because that would have been the language he grew up with.
Okay, thank you. It was just because I think you were mentioning another poster, different one earlier, saying that it was like they were in Italian, German, Slovenian, Croatian, and Polish.
Yes, I've read that.
And that's really helpful. Thank you. I was just wondering really if there were any monopoly documents in Triestine at the time, and also signs were never really in Triestine in the 1800s.
No, it was a spoken dialect, really, as it is mostly even today. But there's a lot of literature on Triestine dialect because it has been so resilient, and it's also part of the identity of the city.
There's much poetry in Trieste dialect, as you
Yeah,
know,
much.
as you're aware.
Yeah.
And of course, the Friulian language is an entirely sort of different language.
It's a different language. Friuli is a completely language that you can't understand.
That's
Yes,
true.
sorry, this gentleman first, and then you.
I just wanted to, after the discussion went out there, I think there's an absolutely iconic item, world famous in London, that represents very well, which is the carpet on Freud's cap, which,
it's called Smyrna carpet in Freud's family. Obviously, it came from the Smyrna port. But I don't exactly know where they come from, Salonika, but Freud himself did a trip to Athens from Trieste, which is his famous Athens trip to Trieste, and at that time with Lloyd's, the shipping company, and taking a ship from Trieste, which also, in a way, that tells the story between the two cities competing, because the Lloyd's shipping company was kind of a diplomatic as well as spy network for the Austrian Empire at the time, and they would be going all these ports and obviously watching what's going on in Izmir as well at the time. So
And it's interesting that
but
Freud,
carpet trade was
carpet trade, yes. And Freud doing his medical training in Trieste,
Yes.
neurological things. So this is really, the city's a magnet for incredible number of figures that became absolutely key for the 20th century culture.
I'm just interested in the Triestino dialect. How does it flourish so well now? Does Italy allow Trieste some education in Triestino, as in Bolzano, that they have their own language? They are taught in German as well as...
Freely Veneto Giulia is a privileged area in Italy.
Is it?
It has very heavy subsidies from Rome. And just as I don't know in Udine what the situation is with the Friulan language, but I do remember when I worked in Udine in the 70s that you would hear Friulan spoken in certain sort of trattorias. And certainly the basic Friulan greeting, which is Mandy, you would hear that very often. People would say, they wouldn't say buongiorno, they'd say bon di. Because they would in Trieste, they'd say Mandy when they walked in, which is Friulan. But the dialect, I think, it's hard. I mean, I don't think it's a conscious policy on the government of Bray or the authorities of Italy to encourage the dialect. The dialect is there. You hear it every day. You take the number 6 bus to Parkala or to Miralai, you would hear Triestine dialect more often than you would hear High Italian. But of course, what one has to remember is that in the 1970s, when I first lived in Trieste, everyone over the age of 65 who had had an average education would have also been taught German. And so that opened to them all kinds of avenues of access Austrian and German literature and culture.
But still, I'm interested that in that town, a local dialect should continue to flourish, where in other parts of it vanished, and I wondered why.
It hasn't vanished in Naples.
Well, nor in Venice. Venice,
Not in Venice.
And it's a variant of the niche. I mean, I remember a taxi driver in Trieste recently saying to me, in Venice, they say doviti va, not where you're going. But in Trieste, it's a variation of the Istrian dialect. He said it's doviti va.
Oh my gosh.
So there is an interest amongst the two.
How about vodka? Vodka comes from Trieste dialect, or the name of the James Joyce?
Oh, Volta,
Vodka,
yes.
yes. I'm
No.
not, it's not Irish, right?
Yes, no, it's an Italian name. It's the inventor of the sort of battery. It's an iconic name for technology of the time. So that's where it comes from.
Of course, there's Pasolini, I think, who was assassinated in Trieste as well.
No, well, he wasn't assassinated in Trieste, he was assassinated near Rome. But Pasolini penned much poetry and much literature in Friulian dialect,
Right.
which was his mother's mother tongue.
Great. Peter Mansel, intriguing when you mentioned that there were Circassian and other Muslim refugees who went via Trieste to other parts of the Muslim world. I assume the Circassian women at the time were reputed to be the most beautiful women in the Ottoman Empire. So what kind of people and Muslims came through Trieste to...
Sorry, it wasn't Circassian women, it was whole populations of villages in the Balkans who left as the Russians advanced in 1877 to 1878. So whole families, and it's one of the strengths of the Ottoman Empire. They had a policy of repopulating Anatolia and the Middle East with these Circassians who were loyal to the Ottoman Empire. That's why Amman, for example, has a Circassian community put there by the Ottomans to control the local Arabs. It wasn't women. I don't think there was a slave market in Trieste, but I may be wrong.
Not that I know of.
The Jordanian royal family still have a Circassian bodyguard.
Exactly.
Yes.
And also the Lloyd Triestino is shipping Ottoman soldiers. I mean, it's serving as an Austrian aid to the Ottoman Empire.
So on. I thank you. Oh, yes, there's one question.
Three fascinating papers, thank you all very much. Could Richard Bassett say what Winkelmann, the founder of classical art history, was doing in Trieste before he was murdered there?
Yes, I can say. He had originally decided to travel to Vienna, and then had fallen out with his companion at that time, and decided to return to Rome. And so he was going to get onto a boat in Trieste to Ancona, and then from Ancona moved to Rome, when he had this encounter with a man who proceeded to fall out with him. And according to the Austrian police report, which is very detailed, 48 pages, he admitted at his interrogation that he wanted to take 7 gold coins and medallions which Winkelmann had been granted as awards by various members of German ruling houses, and the chap, when Winkelmann quite understandably resisted his attempt to steal these coins and medallions, the chap stabbed Winkelmann several times, and Winkelmann didn't die immediately. In fact, the Austrian authorities came and he had time to dictate his last will and testament before he expired. So,
Is he buried in?
yes, there's a wonderful mausoleum to him, and Orto Lapidario, which is, was created by subscription by the leading families of Trieste. And, the long lists of names at the entrance of the mausoleum show again the great diversity of the Triestine merchant class. And there's some English names there: the Moores, the Hepburns, the Holts, but a lot of obviously Austrian names. And there were donations from all over Europe. It's a very fine feature of Trieste, like today.
Yes, one final question then.
Well, I just want to add something. I want to tell you a bit about the Greeks in Trieste.
Please do.
If you have a moment.
Absolutely, please do.
So, they started arriving in 1750, and by you saw the Greek church, but by the middle of 1850, they are already very, very prosperous. They have immense buildings, very villas, palaces that now belong to the Association Generale. There are also great benefactors in the city. The poor house that has, it's a huge building and has statues of its benefactors. 7 out of the 16 are Greeks. The Children's Hospital is a donation by the Greeks. The Psychological Hospital is a donation by the Raleigh family for the children and the Galati family for the rest. But it's they have newspapers. There is a Greek hospital, so it's a very big presence. Until 1920, this Constantine economy that you mentioned, who fought as a pilot, an airplane pilot for the Austrians in the First World War, then became a famous neurologist and is honored by a stamp in Austria. His brother stayed in Italy and was very much involved with the Children's Hospital. There are also a lot of Greek Jews in Trieste. The Greek consulate had 3 times more Greek Jewish passports than normal, than the Orthodox Greek passports. And anyway, now the community has, of course, disappeared, almost disappeared, because the Catholics imposed that the children should be brought up as Catholic in mixed marriages. So now the Rileys are all Catholics. The economists are all Catholics. We don't see them anymore. But the Riley that I mentioned earlier, he was a student of Joyce, and he was the one who got Joyce out when the war broke out. Anyway.
Fantastic. That's fascinating. To thank our 3 speakers for fantastic contributions and papers. Thank you very much. It's great to bring this, but this is not the end. You know, we're already plotting maybe ×2, Trieste and the Levant ×2. But in the meantime, I invite everyone to join us for a glass of wine and talk further with our speakers.